Hello, welcome to The Drum. I'm Eleanor Hall. Coming up, criminal convictions see Labor's candidate for Fremantle disendorsed on day 4 of the campaign. Oxford historian Peter Frankopan joins us to explain the new old world order. And the federal government embraces Middle Eastern investors. Joining me on the panel, contributor to The Spectator Australia and Quadrant, Rebecca Weisser, writer and broadcaster Sunil Badami, and entrepreneur and managing director of Crescent Wealth, Talal Yassine. And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum. Well, both leaders have had unwelcome distractions from campaigning today. Labor has been trying to put out a political fire in Western Australia. It's disendorsed former Maritime Union organiser Chris Brown for failing to disclose drink driving and assault offences from his late teens. Mr Brown says they're spent convictions and the union has backed him. But that hasn't convinced party leaders who installed Josh Wilson as Fremantle's new candidate today.
The only reason that the ALP is aware of this is because I've been open and honest right throughout this process on paper and verbally. I'm not obliged to put that out there. That's my history.
We're not all members of the Salvation Army. It is a crime, actually, to go out there and try and do what these people are trying to do to destroy Chris's credibility. They're going to have to be very careful on who says and who does what, because they could find themselves in court.
The National Secretary of the party investigated these matters. He found there had been a deliberate misleading. He recommended that, therefore, this person shouldn't be our candidate. I 100% back that decision.
And who would have thought that the candidate from the MUA would have turned up like that?
And the Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull was also troubleshooting over being named in the Panama Papers.
Well, can I just say to you that as the article acknowledged, there is no suggestion of any impropriety whatsoever. There is nothing new there.
Rebecca, it's hardly helpful for the Prime Minister to be in the same headline as the Panama Papers. It plays into that whole Labor tag of Malcolm's millionaires. But has the Prime Minister done the right thing in coming out and talking about it today, or has it only sort of flamed the issue in the public's eye?
Well, I think Labor can't really go too hard on this because he was named alongside former Labor Premier Neville Wran. So I suppose, Labor will have to be mindful of that, and that will hold them back. I think the Prime Minister obviously had to respond because, the question had been raised, and I think the article made it clear that there was no impropriety. It wasn't new, no wrongdoing. So I don't think it's, it's a big distraction at this stage.
Talal, Labor would hardly have been wanting to have been disendorsing a candidate in the first week of the campaign. How damaging is that?
Well, I think they had to make a decision and they had to make it quickly. And someone's made a judgment call that that's the best action for the party. Obviously, I don't speak for the party or anyone else for that matter, but I do think it's not a great thing, but I don't think it will matter at the end of the day. It's a long campaign. There's 2 months to go. A week is a long time in politics. 2 months,
is forever.
Is an eternity.
What do you think, though, Sunil, about the Labor disendorsement? Because, have they, as I was asking the same question to Rebecca, have they inflamed the situation by disendorsing him? Could it have just sort of slipped through?
Look, I think, let's face it, in the history of Australian politics, allegations of assault never stopped Mark Latham running for Prime Minister or Tony Abbott indeed becoming Prime Minister, as we found in the Barbara Ramjan allegations. I think it's really good. There is no place for violence. We don't know the full story, but I think the disendorsement has more to do with local Fremantle politics than any grand principle at stake. But it is a good thing. Hopefully we've got someone less punchy in Parliament now.
We've got these two sort of caricatures in a way playing to each side. Malcolm's millionaires, Malcolm in a top hat, Bill Shorten in a hard hat. These sorts of things can actually take off in campaigns. Rebecca, you've covered a few in your time. How dangerous can they be?
I don't think it's, I think the reality is that that's the significance of today. There's framing going on and each side is trying to frame the other in a negative light, and both of these incidences have been used to try and put some to flesh onto that frame. I mean, I would say it's sort of a bit nil-all at the end of the day. I don't think, it's a very long campaign, and so, we'll see how it goes, but I'd expect to see more of this come through because those are the themes that each side will try to use when they're negatively branding the other side, and then you'll see both of them try to come forward with their own positive framing of the issues. And
do you think that today Labor should have disendorsed that candidate? Because he is actually defending himself. I believe he's even taking court action.
I think that both of the comments that I would agree with both of your comments. I think that there was local politics. The fellow who's now the candidate obviously wanted to be candidate all along. Apparently he was more popular and was overridden by, central, headquarters. So that's obviously played through in one way. I think it was probably they were thinking, the other side can do a lot with this, and I think they could have. I think, from my point of view, leaving aside the merits of the case, I think it was, in terms of the straight politics, it was the smart thing to do for them.
Well, in terms of political sort of looks today, the Prime Minister apparently followed up a campaign appearance by going to a lunch at a club in Melbourne, which is only open to men. Sunil, is that a smart thing for a PM to be doing while on a campaign?
Well, it depends on the PM, and it depends on what PM or which PM Malcolm Turnbull is on any particular day. Here's someone who was a progressive, who supported marriage equality and climate change and social inclusion and more women in cabinet. So it definitely is a bad look, but it isn't as bad a look as being named in the Panama Papers. And what struck me today was that he is an intellect, Malcolm Turnbull, no doubt about it. A Rhodes Scholar, a man who can expound on a number of issues. But you have to question his judgment, not just in this case, not just in the case of advising FAI after the infamous 1997 Firelight memo at Goldman Sachs, where he was chairman, not even the Goldwyn Gretsch situation. So it makes me worry, I think, despite his intellect, that he may do things that could seem foolish or act in a way that may not be in his best interests or indeed possibly the country's.
Foolish things could actually be the downfall of leaders in this campaign. I mean, Talal, one of my colleagues had a text from a Labor strategist today saying that too many days, too few ideas, too much possibility for, I think he used a word which I can't say on camera, but yes, that the mistakes could actually come to dominate the campaign. Yes. Is that the danger of a long campaign like this?
Look, I think so. I think not only is there the danger of making mistakes along the way, but I don't think Australian people are watching this campaign or listening to it in the general sense. It's 2 months. And so all the politicians and a lot of the leaders, some Labor has released some policies, but the main game's towards the end. When you start, whatever money you have, you save it. Whatever policy ideas you have, you save it. If you're in the media, well, you know there's more to come. There's more campaign to go. And so it's a war of attrition, as opposed to a campaign. It's not a 3-week, 3.5 week, put your policies out there, compare yourself, give it your best, make a decision. It's not 12 rounds, it's 24 rounds. And I think there's a lot of issues that can arise. The law of unintended consequences can and will apply. And I think some of the stuff we're talking about now, next week will be forgotten. And if it remains what I call this low-level interaction, it will be a very boring campaign, waiting for the ideas.
There is an element from last week that's coming up. There's a tweak in last week's budget that's gone almost unnoticed, a move to relax restrictions around Islamic finance and open Australia up to wealthy Middle Eastern investors. The government says that Sharia-law compliant asset-backed financing is well suited to major infrastructure projects, meaning that we could be hearing a lot more from the Gulf states when it comes to roads, rail and ports. Now, Talal, you are the banker on the panel, so I'm going to come to you to explain this change in the budget, and also if you can explain what exactly is Sharia or Islamic finance?
Well, very happy to. And there's been articles in Australian Financial Review, and I've got my little stuff. I've read the budget.
We've even got the budget papers
itself in some detail. I've got to say this is an excellent and welcome development for Australia. I note that the budget did not say anything about Sharia or Islamic. It said asset-backed. So it encompasses a whole universe of responsible investment or different kinds of investment.
But you are an expert in Sharia finance.
In Sharia finance.
Why is that
So
important?
What does that mean? In Australia, we have have got significant regulation, and the unintended consequence of that regulation sometimes makes it difficult to do different kind of structures, and that's all they are, different kinds of structures. So if you want to do an infrastructure asset, a bond of some sort, or trade, we have a lot of tax consequences where the law of unintended consequences applies, where you have capital gains tax that applies, that ought not to, but only but for the structure. And so the government has now brought in a change from 1 July 2018, which has meant that the capital gains tax on a particular structure, which may be Sharia compliant or maybe just asset backed, now no longer applies. And so if, for example, you come to Australia and you decide to invest in infrastructure, long-term infrastructure.
Now, Sharia compliant relates to the problem that in Sharia law with interest.
Yes. So people of the Islamic faith do not believe that interest or usury should apply. However, if you structure it differently, for example, you buy an asset and you own part of that asset, and it's a rental, as opposed to I will lend you money, you will give me 5% back, and that's quite a different deal. Also, and importantly, is the ownership structure. So you can unitize or split up into little pieces an asset, and you need to own a particular section of that asset. You can't borrow money in globo, like just here's 100 million, you don't know what part you own. You've got to actually have an ownership. That's what why we call it asset-backed or asset-based. That is really the difference.
You say that this is not coming until 2018, but have you already seen more interest in investing in Australia because of this?
Sure.
In your business?
Look, there's been significant interest, and there is significant interest in Australia from the Gulf states today. The Abu Dhabi Investment Authority has billions invested. Hassad, Qatari Agriculture Group, owns...
You say that you've had this interest today?
Yeah, that's already on the ground. However, it's not the big guys, like the multi-trillion-dollar sovereign funds that are quoted everywhere, that we are really interested in. They're already here. They already have their own fund managers. They already deal in New York and London and Singapore, and Australia is just another stop where there's a couple of $100 billion already. What we should be interested in as a nation is the fact that that is the responsible investors like Sedco Capital out of Jeddah or Mazik, who are responsible investors and are mid-market. And we've made the changes. For example, we've got new investment vehicles like limited partnerships that the government's brought in helpfully. And that means that we can actually expect more jobs and growth through more investment in Australia.
Rebecca, is this a good move?
Look, I don't have a problem with it. I think that the more that the Islamic world focuses on building infrastructure, bridges, railroads, airports, all of this sort of thing, the more it invests in and is part of the modern world, the better for them, for us, for everyone. And they have very large funds, and that's great. You know, what I would like, I mean, I think there's a lot of good work that gets done, you know, with the Gulf states. So that's good. I mean, with Saudi Arabia, I would like to see more reciprocity there. For example, when the Saudis bring money in here, but for example, to give for religious purposes, but that's strictly forbidden to do that in Saudi Arabia. I think that should go both ways. So long as we're not, you know, Christian, you couldn't put any money into, say, Christianity, for example, or anything actually other than Islam, then I don't think they should put money into religious purposes here. But I think that investing in bridges and roads, and good on them, that's a good thing. That's what I like to see.
Sunil, sorry, let me just come to Sunil first. Sunil, we have had some National Party politicians complain about Chinese investment in Australia. Do you think that it's possible that we could see a backlash against Islamic investment here?
Well, I think even if you took the racial aspect out of it, you know, those people who are concerned about halal cornflakes or not, my advice, don't eat them. I think the big concern many Australians might have, similarly to Chinese investment, is that state-owned operations or conglomerates, which are backed by totalitarian regimes with a history of human rights abuses and corruption, are buying strategic Australian assets, like, for example, the S. Kidman cattle leases, or Liang Guangwei, former PLA, People's Liberation Army member, backed by a state government, a Chinese government conglomerate, spending $64 million to buy property next to ASIO, or the sale of the Darwin port to Chinese interests, government-controlled interests, at a time when China is now expanding very bullishly in the South China Sea. That would be the concern, that we cannot regulate those investments. But you know, I mean, most of Australia's biggest investors are from English-speaking countries. You know, Rebecca used to work for one of the world's most powerful media conglomerates run by an American, Rupert Murdoch.
Yeah. Now, look, just briefly to you, Talal, do you want to answer
that? Has to do with anything.
Look, absolutely. But I think
very briefly.
I think there's not about the religious element here, even though that gets some airplay. Saudi Arabia has a 2030 vision. It's a country that's changing dramatically. Even you know, they want 6 million jobs created by 2030. They've got massive social change. Dubai's become the new technological hub of the East. We have a lot to learn and a lot to gain from there, and I think it's the people who are investing here, the middle market that I'm talking about, all these organisations that are owned by governments are already here. We're talking about private sector investment.
Well, as we've been hearing, seismic political and economic shifts across the Middle East and Asia mean that Australia is increasingly looking up to its northern neighbours instead of back to Europe. Now, you might feel like the world is changing faster and more dramatically than ever before, but our next guest argues that this is actually just the re-establishing of a very old world order. Oxford historian Dr Peter Frankopan is the author of The Silk Roads, and he joins us from London ahead of his appearance at the Sydney Writers' Festival next week. Professor Frankopan, welcome to The Drum.
Hi there.
Now look, I'm going to start at the end of your huge and, I've got to say, marvellously readable history, because it concludes that the Silk Roads are now rising again. Why now, and should Western leaders be alarmed? Does this also mean the fall of the West?
Well, I think we are all aware that we're living in changing times. I mean, I think if you stack up the problems, the concerns, and also the opportunities and challenges everywhere from Turkey through Russia and Ukraine, through the Middle East, Iran, China, all the things you've just been talking about, in fact, we feel that the world is in a state of flux. And I think as a historian, what my job is to do is to try to understand where those trends have come from and to try to make sense of this world that's rising around us. And so one of the things that I've tried to do in my book is to explain that world, those kind of questions that you've just been talking about how does one engage with the Islamic Middle East, how does one engage with China, those are entirely reasonable and long-standing questions that people were concerned about 2,500 years ago. So the process of change in itself doesn't strike me as necessarily being as dramatic or as worrying as we think that it is.
You make the point in your book that whereas it used to be the Brits who could travel halfway around the world without leaving British territory, now it's the Chinese. How carefully are the Chinese building these links?
Well, I think, again, taking back to what you're talking about, Islamic finance, if there were other investors who could buy the Kidman Cattle Ranch or the Port of Darwin, then then they could. The problem is that those who have money in their pockets right now look like that they're not based anymore in Western Europe or in the United States, partly because there are other opportunities, other things that they are more comfortable in pursuing. But I think that this is a new world where resources and planning for the future is being done by non-Western states. And that raises the kinds of question that Rachel was talking about as well, about how does one engage with regimes that perhaps we are very uncomfortable with, and either because of their human rights concerns or abuses, or because we are just uncomfortable about the fact that, unlike with an Australian election where you're worrying about a week in politics, China are very clearly planning for decades into the future. And so the One Belt, One Road initiative, which is China's signature economic and foreign policy, is weaving connections not just into Southeast Asia and the Pacific region and into Australia, but the amount of money and the amount of investment and the amount of change across Asia is properly eye-watering. It's on a scale that I think is almost inconceivable, because that's where foreign reserves are, that's where the willpower is, and that's where the political drive to plan for the future is able to make these long-term decisions.
And you don't think that means that Western leaders should be worried, that it does mean that there's going to be a fall in the West as these other countries rise?
Well, I'm not sure there's a great deal we can do about this, first of all. Second, it seems to me that the major international organisations, like the United Nations, have been absolutely invisible, if not useless, in dealing with things like Ukraine and Russia, with ISIS and its rise in the Middle East, with the state failure in Iraq. The UN was almost nowhere with discussions with Iran and bringing Iran back into the family of nations. So, I think that the way that the Western order is reconfigured means that we are completely unable to understand these peoples, whether we're talking about the Islamic world, whether we're talking about China, whether we're talking about Russia. We don't bother teaching our kids about these cultures. We don't know anything about their histories. We don't speak their languages by and large. And so we deal with them in an emotional way. And I think that that is a real significant problem in our current political climates. And we'll see that in the United States in the election coming up. We have later this year. We have this here in the United Kingdom where we're tearing our hair out about whether Britain should leave the European Union. People's reactions in the West to this changing world are deeply emotional. They're not based on facts. They're not based on strategy. They're based on what we think and what we feel by looking at people rather than on deep knowledge. And as an academic and as a historian and as an educator, those kinds of problems are a real worry.
And it's really interesting, your book reminds us of the importance of maps in our perception of the world. What for you is the biggest shift that you've seen when you look at the world less from a Western perspective and shifting it more from an Eastern perspective?
Well, it seems to me if you want to study world history, you should stand in the middle of the world. And the connector points that linked the Pacific, Asia, Europe and Africa until the European discovery of the Americas, or until the European arrival in the Americas, rather, was right in the heart of the world, in what's now Iran, Iraq, roughly that kind of area. And that's where all of our major global religions have come from. That's where all of our major language groups collide. That's where the greatest exchanges between civilizations have been. The problem is, over the last 300 years, Europe's rise has rewritten history so that we think that there is a direct line from ancient Athens and Aristotle to Rome, and then somehow Europe inherited all these things, and that Europe has always been the driver of progress. And if you are able to stand back and look at the world more dispassionately, you'll see that progress has normally not been driven by Europe at all. In fact, Europe's history, if you were to choose one thing that would define it, it's not its progress, it's been its propensity towards violence. We are great innovators in Europe of weapons, of castles, and eventually of mechanized violence that allow things like the Holocaust to happen in Europe. And so I think there is a point at which one can reevaluate the history of the world by trying to detach from that primacy of the fact that the last 300 years have been great for Europe. My guess will be that the next 300 years will not be so great for Europe, that moment of brilliant sunshine, Europe has had its day. So, I think that there is a point at which that change and those new rises of new powers trying to find their way is entirely inevitable. And it's difficult to adapt to that in our political systems where we try and think about an election 18 months away, because the kind of structural change we're looking at will affect the world that our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren grow up and live in. And I think it's very important to try to lay the ground for that now rather than when it's too late.
And Peter, I do love your description of Western Europe during the height of the Silk Road's powers as a regional backwater. Now, let me just bring Rebecca in here, though. I mean, Rebecca, do you agree that the West's day is done, Europe's day is done?
I actually wanted to ask Peter one question. I'm looking forward to reading your book, and I wondered, you say that we've rewritten history in the West. I was thinking, for example, of a history like Will and Ariel Durant's History of Civilization, which begins with our Oriental heritage. And certainly when I was educated, we were always taught that all of these religions came, it all came out of Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, and we were taught about that our numbers were Hindu-Arabic numbers, and so forth. The rise that our language was an Aryan language, the rise of the Aryan people coming out of northern India, and so forth. So I'm not sure, not having read your book, whether that's what you're saying isn't correct, or whether, how does that fit in? I mean, because that seemed to me very much acknowledging the centrality of the role of as the Durant said, of our Oriental heritage.
Yes, and that's all prehistory. I mean, that's all sort of ancient past, where the wheel, the domestication of the horse, agriculture was developed 10,000 BC. The thing is that part of the world has been absolutely central forever. And in fact, in many ways, the history of the 20th century, I know that we are obsessed in Europe about talking about the First and the Second World Wars. In many ways, the history of the 20th century has also been about this region as well. Just to pick the recent past, where the struggle for control of oil was something that was paramount in the minds of British war planners during the First World War. During the Second World War, American State Department officials called the oil of the Middle East the greatest single prize in human history. And the thing is I think that one needs to take a view that you don't just detach the long distant past where something happens and then the Greeks and the Romans get going and then it's the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and and great scholarship in the West, because there are scholars today who ask why is it that Muslims haven't won any Nobel Prizes, for example. And I think the point is that 500 years ago, if we'd been able to beam television around the world, my equivalent wouldn't have been based at Oxford University. I'd have been based in Bokhara or Samarkand or Baghdad or Damascus. And in fact, I would have been based there not just 500 years ago, I'd have been based there 1,000 years ago, I'd have been based there 2,000 years ago. So the kind of questions one needs to ask is, well, if that region was so important, why did it stop being so important? How does it fit into the control of into the rise of the West? And second, how does it come back up again? So I'm not really that bothered about these arcane discussions about saying, well, algebra came from the Middle East, let's doff our cap and acknowledge that. Actually, this part of the world has been absolutely central in global history and always has been and always will be. So in today's world, that is exactly where the great opportunities and challenges all lie, in India and Pakistan, in Iran, Iraq and Syria, what will happen with the religious fundamentalism, and in fact across the steppe world of Russia, the Ukraine and Central Asia. So I think it's putting that piece of the jigsaw puzzle back in and explaining that the world does all hang together.
Now,
And
Peter, we are hurtling.
Peter,
we're hurtling towards the end of the show, and Sunil, I know that you're Australian, but you have obviously Indian roots. You have a question, I think, for Peter.
Well, Peter, I guess I think of, say, someone like Niall Ferguson, who has always portrayed the rise of the Middle East or the East as an opposition to the West, that somehow the West must fall for the East or the Middle East or any other part of the world to rise. And yet, of course, we see with the election of the new London Lord Mayor, someone who is of Indian or Middle Eastern background, running one of the biggest elected constituencies in Europe, if not the world. I wonder, given that my children are biracial and both my fellow panellists are the children of immigrants, does it really have to be in such binary terms?
We're so close to off-air, please be brief.
Well, I would never criticise a fellow historian's points of views. I don't agree with Niall Ferguson as it happens, and I think that generally people tend to want to get on. The problem is the story of Europe is one where we tend to fight each other. Even Strabo in the 1st century AD said Western Europeans always pick up weapons and try and kill each other. Normally, discussion allows biculturalism and multi-race families and multi-ethnic families.
We could talk forever. I'm so sorry to cut you off, but we are just going to have to wrap up. That's all for The Drum. Thanks so much to the panel. I'm Eleanor Hall. I'll see you tomorrow.